Thank you, guys. Thanks for the invite. And today we're going to talk about what is Akraino Edge Stack. And many of you probably have heard about this Linux Foundation project. And we will also touch base on LF Edge. And Akraino Edge Stack is a project under LF Edge. And I will give you guys an introduction about the LF Edge as well. And we're going to talk about, how does this Akraino Edge Stack and the ONF community, they're already working together on some of the project, and how the users are planning to deploy them, and how we can actually work more together on this project. So when we talk about edge deployment, there's many varieties of edge deployment, right? So people assume about, like a one sort of edge deployment for many use cases, but it is not the real story. So if you look at this picture, the edge deployment could be in several sizes. It could be something deployed in a customer location, and it could be something deployed in a cell tower for virtualization of like a BBU, for example, and it could be something deployed in a central office, or it could be deployed in a public building, something like stadiums and other locations. So there's a wide varieties of edge deployment could really happen. And when we talk about the solution that goes inside this edge deployment, for example, the cloud stack that would go within this edge, it could be in a different form factor. For example, the things that need to be deployed in like in a customer home, not necessarily need to be a 2-rack solution, right? So the solution that would go in a central office, not necessarily it has to be a smaller box. So there is depending upon the use cases, like a different sizing of this edge deployment could actually happen. So what is interesting in this is, if you guys actually remember the cloud computing world, when you work with the gentleman before us actually talked about open source and its challenges and how do you take it and put it in production. One of the challenges that cloud computing everybody has seen is you take multiple open source together, then you integrate them. For example, you go to a Kubernetes community, you get Kubernetes, then you go to ONF and you take the ONF software, then you go to ONAP, you take the ONAP software, then you go to like OpenStack, you take OpenStack software, and then operating system and drivers, SDN solution. We can list out about 100 solutions like that, right? And you need all these 100 open sources together. I'm just giving you an example, but at least 10 open source together to put together a package, and that would run in production along with the application. But putting that together as a full package, it is really a complicated solution, even with the cloud computing deployed in a 10 location. But when we talk about this wide varieties of different factors of deployment, and also the scale of the edge computing, it's really reducing the latency and like installing it in many locations. When we say many locations, we are really talking about 10,000 or even 100+ location. So taking all this open source together and putting a full holistic solution for a particular use case, it is a challenge that every users were facing. So that is where Akraino Edge Stack comes into place, is the community can take all the open source together and integrate upfront, instead of like done by every user. User A does it, user B does it, user C does it, but they don't know what they're doing together. Instead that, like this community, user A, B, C, and whoever it is, they can actually collaborate in the community itself and then integrate all the things together for a particular use case. That's where the Akraino Edge Stack comes into the picture. So this is a summary of the mission statement of Akraino Edge Stack, and primarily Akraino Edge Stack is focused on like a particular verticals, and that starts with the telco. It's primarily focused on the telco related use cases, either it is a wireline or wireless, and it is also focused on the enterprises, enterprises that including the IoT use cases, that also including the industrial IoT use cases. So these are the two primary like vectors that this particular project works on. So as I pointed out, there are 4 key goals that this community focus on. The number one is that to create an end-to-end configuration, okay, in an installable manner into a production. So that is a primary like goal of this community, is to bring a cloud stack, edge stack that could be deployed at like different use cases at different locations. The second one is like a develop project for end-to-end configuration. For example, if we take all this open sources, 10 open source together, they always forget about security, for example. They always forget about operational requirements. They always forget about many other aspects of bringing things together, the glue that would bring all these things together from an installation perspective. So those are the gaps that, like each community doesn't address. If you go to Kubernetes, they will talk about only the Kubernetes. You go to OpenStack, they only talk about OpenStack. You go to, like a specific, another open source, they only talk about that specific software. But from an operational aspect, somebody has to look at everything together. And when there is a problem in the engine, when there is a problem in the tire, they need to figure out like where the problem is. Like you need a full holistic solution that would look at every piece of it. So this community focus on that operational aspect of the whole end-to-end stack as well. Then the third thing is like, in order to make this whole thing work together, there need to be a common API between all these open sources. Because when we try to integrate them, if the same language is not really exchanged in a software level between a different open source together, there is no way for them to integrate in a nice way. And that's what like this community focus on as well. The fourth one is like, this is not to kill the business of the people, that vendors and the people working in delivering this as an end-to-end solution before. So in this case, like the community has the upfront integration, but the vendors can take this integration and they can actually provide additional support for this particular integration. So we do encourage the vendors to be part of this ecosystem. So this picture explains, like I talked about this integration. We call this integration is something called the blueprints. And this is not, when we say blueprint, some people mistaken, what does the blueprint is really mean? It is not a picture. It is not just a diagram that talks about a reference architecture. This is a real code that brings everything together as a full package that can be installed for a particular use cases. Like the way I discussed before, we work on different use cases, not just the telco use cases. It could be an industrial IoT, or it could be an enterprise use cases. So when you look at this picture, so there is a reference architecture that defines what is that particular use case is. For example, SD-WAN is in a use case. For example, we do a RAN intelligent controller deployment that is in a use case. For example, an IoT gateway installation at the location, that is in another use case. So we take all those things, and the blueprint also defines what goes inside, what software goes inside, and what hardware goes inside, what configuration of those software has to be, what configuration of that hardware has to be. So the end goal is that there is a button that you can press that allows you to install the whole end-to-end stack, not in one location, but whatever the number of locations that you need, that application has to run. So that is what we collectively call as a blueprint. And Akraino community encourages multiple blueprints. The reason is that there are multiple use cases, right? There is not a one use case that fits everybody. As I stated, that every vector has like different use cases, and we do support like multiple use cases in the community. So as I point out, like there are two major category of use cases that we work, and this is again the spectrum of use cases. So this is a telco use cases, comes in a different forms factor, that including wireline, wireless, all the ONF related work is going on in this particular area as well, and ORAN related work as well. So you can see that it could be a public building deployment, or it could be a telco based deployment. This is a one primary vector of use cases that this community works on. The second use case is the IoT use cases. And when we started this community, we had the IoT in the equation, but we see that, like how many people are already doing a production deployment of IoT in a different varieties of, like industry. It could be a healthcare, it could be a industrial automation. We see a lot of blueprints that already be in, production deployment, and that code has been brought into Akraino community for the end-to-end integration. So we do actually see a lot of blueprints in this particular area. So we do had a first release. So it's about like a year plus that this community was started. And in June 6, 2019, we had release 1 that has been announced. And there was a 10+ blueprint, which has been released out of this particular release. And this picture explains, like what were the blueprints that was part of the release 1. Okay, so there were many people were involved in this particular release, and you can see that there are many blueprints. And AT&T worked on 2 primary blueprints. One is the network cloud blueprint That is for the 5G core deployment. And the second one is the radio edge cloud deployment. This is to deploy the ORAN software, the RAN intelligent controller, which actually takes the RAN intelligent controller from the ORAN software community, and it actually integrates with the cloud solution to provide that end-to-end deployment. So that is the radio edge cloud deployment, and this is something we partnered up with the Nokia. And again, these blueprints are not just developed by one company. There are many, many companies and freelance developers and enterprises have been involved in some of these blueprints. And as I pointed out, there is a way to group this blueprint. For example, you want a one deployment of edge compute in your central office or a data center, but you could run multiple use cases on them, right? For example, many use cases could, for example, if you take telco, there could be a CU, DU, and many other aspect of the telco could run on the same cloud. But that integration you can bring from a different software resources or software upstream community. And the one concept that this community follows is that when we take a software from a different open source community, we try to not to fork that software. The reason why we don't fork that software is like when you fork it, then it became a technical debt to keep up that fork all the time. So we actually work with that upstream community and make sure that whatever the gap that this community is seeing for that use case, we work with them and we fill that gap so that the gap is really being addressed in the upstream community itself. And that is a goal that this community work on. And whatever that, the gaps that is across multiple open source together, something like operational tooling, something like security, something like integrating everything together, that is something that this community itself actually develops it. That's what we collectively call as a blueprint. And what is in the key takeaways and what's next is that there's a lot of support, and there is a 60+ companies has been already participating and in the LF Edge. And so what we are really doing here is that we are trying to bring this unified framework across multiple blueprints as well. And people may think that why we have 10 blueprints, why can't that be a one? Because as I pointed out on the first slide, the deployments could be a different one. Okay, it could be a small, ARM-based, a small, like a Raspberry Pi sort of a deployment, or it could be a deployment that is going on a large server. So if the use case is different, then there is a different software customization or the configuration is needed to support it. That's why you see a different blueprints. And the community is actually working on additional blueprints for R2, and that including IoT space. And there are also the application side of the equation is also being worked on, something like gaming, connected cars. For example, Tencent is working on 5G-related use cases. Baidu is working on connected car-related use cases. So there are a lot of use cases that are related to 5G, as well as the other spectrum of IoT side that is also being addressed on this community now. As I pointed out that we are working on this API and by collaborating with upstream communities so that we can have this cohesive API methodology across multiple open source together. So I mentioned about Akraino Edge Stack, and I also mentioned about, I will talk about LF Edge. And LF Edge is an umbrella organization for this edge computing project under the Linux Foundation. The reason why the LF Edge was formed is that there was a lot of edge project across open sources. So we need a place where we can bring them together so that there is a common collaboration among all this LF, edge-related project, that including Akraino Edge Stack. So the reason you see multiple projects there is that there are different sectors and different a reason of different software need to be developed, okay? So if you look at this project, so there are 5 projects where the anchor project for LF Edge, and again, I say this is an umbrella project. The membership is paid one time, and the people, companies can become a member in a LF Edge level, then they can actually freely participate on it, any of the project under the LF Edge. That including Akraino Edge Stack, there is a EdgeX Foundry, which is actually focused on the IoT-related gateways. And there's Edge Virtualization Engine that is very focused on, a gateway. They also focus on the IoT gateway-related workloads. The Open Glossary is another interesting documentation project, because there's a lot of terminology, like people misuse or they use it in a different way and they get confused and they fight on that, is that there's not a common terminology being used in the industry. So especially on edge computing, if you do a Google, and everybody talks about something different about edge computing, right? So we're trying to make sure that there is a common terminology, common place where it's like a Wikipedia of edge computing, where everybody can see what the terminology, what the picture, who's working on what. So that's what that project is primarily focused on. Home edge is another project which basically, like a focus on home sort of edge deployment as well. And there are 2 other new projects in the pipeline, but again, there are many projects, like want to be part of LF Edge. The good part of this is that, like it brings the people together at one place where we can communicate together and prepare what is needed to support it. I'll just quickly skip, and the details is like if you go to wiki.akraino.org, or in that place where you can see all the information about these blueprints, and also you can see about the collaboration that you can get engaged on, and what are the meetings that we actually conduct. The slides will be there for you guys to access it, so you can see those links. But again, if you go to the wiki.akraino.org, you can see all the information about this community. And specifically, I think this is Tom will talk about that, but where we are collaborating with the ONF is primarily around SIBA is one good example. But we like to have more and more project come in. So the Akraino is providing the edge stack that is production deployable, and taking the ONF software and putting on top of that and integrating that as a full solution. That's where the power of these 2 communities can come together, and that's where this community can collaborate so that mutually each community can benefit out of it. So with that, I will hand over to Tom, and I think I took more time.
Thank you. Hopefully I can rise to the challenge here. So I'll skip the. Why is this going so slow? Okay. So let me try to bring all that we've talked about on Akraino a little bit down to earth to what matters to ONF and the things that we're actively involved with here at ONF. And so in this chart, it's hard to see, but if there's some highlighting around the Kubernetes and a regional controller, it's sort of AT&T's intention to deploy SIBA by using this technology, right? It's not something you deploy just one place, it goes in many places. And to make it as easy and cookie cutter as possible, this is a great tool, and it's really symbiotic with what we're doing in SIBA. So if you look at what SIBA does today, it essentially expects there to be an active stack that's ready to run Helm charts to get started. This gets you there, right? And in fact, it can pre-populate the Helm charts that will then run. So it's a wonderful and symbiotic thing to do with SIBA. And since we're in a hurry, I'm going to go on. And this is kind of a mishmash chart. As we move forward into mobility, there's a great opportunity to work with ORAN and ONF and Akraino. We'll be pulling components from multiple open source communities. Once again, we can have a blueprint that pulls in these components, sets them up, and allows us, once again, to cookie cutter this out. Right? The whole idea is automation. That's how you save in OpEx ultimately, and this is a great tool to get that done. And so then the shameless sales pitch comes on, and that is ONF, all you partners here. As we move forward and we think about additional projects and integration of projects at ONF, we look not, and I've got it highlighted there with the Akraino, but in general, we do have a kind of a standard set of tools that help us get the ONF projects going and scaffolded and easy to deploy. And we'd encourage very much, and in fact, from the ones that AT&T will deploy, we'd be willing more than a little to collaborate on making Akraino, make this just dead easy, single button to deploy. There, that probably did that pretty quick. So that leaves us time for some questions, and I can hand it back to Kandan and let him take them.
Depending upon what the question is. So anybody has a question?
There you go. So there's also the organization that's called the Kinetic Edge Alliance, KEA. Are you familiar with that as well, or?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, that's okay. Then forget the question.
That was fast.
That's a good one.
Question? Hi, I was wondering how much Akraino is pushing to sort of drive, for example, making virtualization infrastructure more lean so that in edge deployments where you don't have the footprint to deploy a full cloud, you want to just manage virtual machines alongside with containers, but in a minimal fashion. I have to say I'm not too familiar with Akraino, that's why I'm asking.
Very good question. As I pointed out in one of the slides, that there is a different form factor of deployments. Okay, in some blueprints, the OpenStack has been used. Some blueprint, just the Kubernetes has been used. Even Kubernetes is heavy for deployments like small piece of boxes going in, like for example, light tower, right? And light poles, and those are very thin operating system, and very thin, like a non-Kubernetes solution has also been used, like just simply running a microservices. So the spectrum-wise, like there's a large solution which goes into like depending upon the use cases. There are already a solution that like a very simplified container solution that could actually support these sort of use cases. Especially in IoT world, what we see is that they need a very small gateway boxes that only has like 3 or 4 cores left for the whole thing to run. And 3 or 4 cores, we know that we can't run Kubernetes effectively on 3 or 4 core, and the resiliency need like 3 servers for that. And those solutions are already being addressed within the community. There are a few blueprints already has solution for that.
Yeah, and maybe another tranche at that question is that we see Akraino being able to bring up both what I'd call cloud infrastructure that's able to support multiple workloads, but also what's very interesting for us is when you have such a small deployment that you're not looking to have a general purpose cloud. You're looking to have a cloud-like appliance, right? It's a one-trick pony. That's all you can really afford to put there, but you don't want to waste all of your cloud tools because that's what you're gearing up to do. And so Akraino can help with those equally well.
But so do you see then like to support virtualized workloads, sort of like things like KubeVirt or Virtlet, so using Kubernetes to manage both? Because the thing is, OpenStack was built mainly for multi-tenancy and so on, so a lot of the control plane complexity comes also to the extremely large scale and multi-tenancy, right? So does Akraino look into actually making the overall NFVI leaner, or
So it's really depend upon the use cases. Akraino is driven by use cases, and there's not a one use case, there are multiple use cases. If a use case requires like a multi-tenancy deployment like what Tom was talking about, then the answer is like OpenStack is the right thing to do, or whatever that equivalent that use case really needs it, right? But if it is really solution that fits into the KubeVirt sort of implementation, then we support as well. The one thing we do not do in Akraino is that we do not try to normalize everything into a one thing. And it would eventually will happen over a period of time, for sure. In another 2 years, we may see that like there may be 2 blueprints satisfy everything in the world. But I think there's a time to go there. So the first approach we are taking is like, let people bring what they need as from a use case perspective and the solution perspective. Then there is a way to actually bring the code together and make it like simplified. Unless like people will be having a picture and they're talking about that picture for 2 years without a code, there's no way to normalize it. So the approach that Akraino community really took it is like, bring your code, bring your use case. Let's bring that into a common platform. Thanks.
All right, I think with that, we're out of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank
We're going
you.
to transition.
Appreciate it.